Hello, I'm Barbara Lucas, and welcome to the Green Room, a collaboration between Washtenaw County and Ann Arbor's Community Television Network. Today's guest is Kris Olsson, a biologist and watershed ecologist with the Huron River Watershed Council. She's here today to talk with us about land preservation, how we can do it, and why we should do it. Kris, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Barbara.
Before we get started with our topic, I'd like to mention to the audience that in addition to your day job, you're an elected official, which is Ann Arbor Township trustee, and you're a very active volunteer as chair of Washtenaw County Environmental Council, chair of Washtenaw Climate Reality, and a member of the Citizens Climate Lobby. So what is it that compels you to be such a strong advocate for the environment?
Well, Barbara, I guess it stemmed from my childhood playing out in the woods and watching Wild Kingdom. It sounds kind of cheesy, but it's kind of amazing how powerful shows like that can be for a young person. And it just, as it grew from there, as I went to school and became interested in science, and from there interested in what is the kind of science I could do that would be make the most difference in terms of preserving those woods I grew up running around in.
And so what's the connection between the things you do, water quality, land preservation, climate change advocacy?
Right. So at the Huron River Watershed Council, I work on land protection and working with local governments and citizens on protecting that land so that it can protect the water quality in the Huron River. And the connection is that, the Huron River is only as clean as the land that drains into the river. So as water flows from the very top of a watershed or valley down into the water, it carries with it any kind of pollution. It can increase in temperature as it flows over hot pavement, and it can increase in flow and become erosive to the creeks. And that all affects water quality. And, the Huron provides drinking water to the city of Ann Arbor. So we want to keep that water clean and cool and easier to treat than in some other places. So the cleaner the water is, the more affordable it is to treat so that we can drink it. The more fun it is to swim in, the healthier the fish are. The Huron River is home to a multi-million-dollar fishery. So there are a lot of reasons to protect land and to learn how to live on the land in ways that use up less land.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking about the idea of water getting hotter in terms of climate change, and that would affect the fisheries, right?
Exactly. The fisheries and a whole host of other things all over the watershed. So here in Southeast Michigan, we're already seeing hotter days, more hot days. We're already warming up. We're seeing rainfall in the form of larger storms, more frequent storms and more intense storms. This is all having an impact on the water. So as I was saying, if the water is flowing over hot impervious surfaces like parking lots and rooftops, it's going to carry that higher temperature into the creeks. So we have a kind of double whammy of climate change making water hotter, making the water more erosive as it's coming down in those heavy rainfalls. And development is also doing kind of the same thing. And so it becomes more and more important with climate change to preserve what natural areas we can so that we keep that resilience to climate change, and more of the water that does falls into those natural areas and seeps down and recharges the river in the form of groundwater as opposed to polluted runoff.
Yeah. And I know that you do land surveys as part of your work. Why do you do those surveys?
We've mapped the entire watershed based on aerial photos and other kinds of remote sensing data from state data, from university data. And we've mapped out the remaining wetlands and woodlands and grasslands in the watershed. And it's about a quarter to a third of the watershed is still in a natural condition. And we've done some research on that and ranked them based on some data like size, whether there's water on the site, models that show where that groundwater recharge is mostly happening on those natural areas, and other criteria like that. And that's all on our website, hrwc.org, if you want to know more about that. And so we have this map and we've been sharing it with land preservation programs and conservancies, and they're using that information to help them to prioritize their preservation efforts. Because if we want to protect as much land as possible, we need to figure out where the most important land is to protect. So what are the lands that are providing the most groundwater recharge? What are the lands that are providing the most biodiverse habitats so that we're protecting the most wildlife? What are the areas that are providing the most flood protection and pollution protection and air quality protection? And so our map gets us to part of the way there. It's because it's on a watershed scale. And so what we also do is land surveys where we actually get out onto the land, and that gives us more details on a more micro level. And we do a plant list so we know what are the plants that are growing on the site, what does the landscape look like on the ground, what are the kinds of wetlands that we see, are they floodplain wetlands, are they wet prairie wetlands, are the woods harboring larger, older trees that have more extensive root systems? Is it more of a functioning ecosystem on the ground? And we learn things that we couldn't see from high up. And then we can share that information with the property owners, as well as the conservancies and land preservation programs. And that just creates a relationship between landowners and those programs, and also can help us, again, figure out where are those most ecologically important lands to protect. So if it's a degraded ecosystem, if it's got too many nutrients from polluted runoff or sedimentation, or it has too many invasive species like buckthorn or purple loosestrife, then it's going to be more difficult for those native species to grow, and you might not find them as often, and therefore that ecosystem is not going to be considered as high quality.
Mm-hmm. And do volunteers ever help you with these land surveys?
Absolutely. It's actually a volunteer run program. We have a staff person who organizes the volunteers, but the volunteers are the ones who actually go out and do the surveys.
Mm-hmm. Great. Sounds like a real interesting thing to do. If you have the knowledge, do you guys give them information to train them?
We do. We have training in how to do it. And it's back before COVID, it was an in-person training where we spent the first couple of hours talking about general ecology. What is the connection between, land and water quality and the kinds of things we've been talking about. And then the second part is we actually go out and do a sample survey. And with each team, we do have a volunteer who sort of identifies themselves as a plant expert, meaning they know generally, not all the plants, but they know generally what are the kinds of plants they're going to see, and they can identify most plants that they would typically find in a Michigan wetland or a woodland.
So I know that part of your job is policy. What kind of policies would be helpful in preserving land?
Well, the first policy that we like to recommend to local governments is to first protect this land in the best way that you can. So it starts out as kind of like a pyramid. The bottom of that pyramid is protect the existing natural areas that you have, because those natural areas are providing these ecosystem services like pollution control, climate change resilience, carbon sequestration, water quality benefits, all the things that I talked about, and for free, right? So you don't have to pay them to do it. So the more you can do to make sure those natural areas stay natural, the better. And so one of the ways that local governments are doing that is with a conservation millage. So people have probably heard about the Ann Arbor Greenbelt program and also the County Natural Areas program. So these are property taxes that people pay, and that money goes into purchasing land outright or purchasing conservation easements on land, and that protects it in perpetuity. And so that's one way to do it. We're working with several local governments now on enacting millages in other parts of the watershed. So I think that's very exciting because back in 2000, before we had these millages passed, we had the state parks in the watershed and some county parks, but there was a kind of a smattering of natural areas that were protected throughout the watershed. And just 20 years later, you can actually see a network of open spaces that are now protected. Almost 20,000 acres have been protected through use of our natural areas map and with those conservation programs. So it really makes a big difference. On the other hand, it can't protect all the land, right? You can't protect all of that remaining natural areas by purchasing it. We just don't have the money. So there are a lot of policies that governments can enact to help protect those natural areas with their ordinances. So for folks who don't know, Michigan is a local home rule state, meaning that local cities, villages, and townships are the ones that are in charge of land use. So every township, city, so on has a master plan and a zoning ordinance. And that is where they have rules about where you can put housing, where you can put shopping centers, and so on and so forth. So that has a huge impact on water quality, right? Where you put shopping centers or how much parking space you take up, how big are the houses, how big are the buildings, should you build higher or have a bigger footprint? So all of those things are influenced or they're regulated by the zoning ordinance. So if local governments can allow development that takes up the least amount of space possible and eats up the least amount of natural areas possible, that's what we want to see. And one specific example of that is we like to push for surface water overlay zones or zoning that protects creeks and rivers. And so makes sure that development doesn't occur right up to the edge. And so that the riparian or the woodlands that are next to the river, the riparian wetlands and woodlands are protected. And for instance, in a couple of just 2 of the 67 different townships that are in our watershed, those townships were able to protect 1,700 acres of lands around their creeks just through that ordinance being passed. If there's a wetland ordinance in one of our townships, as an example, that would end up protecting 4,600 acres of natural areas. So you can see that one way is to purchase the land. Another way is to regulate so that you're not allowing development in those lands, and you can have an even bigger impact.
I know when you say the word regulate, there's a lot of people that's a red flag for. I'm just curious, are there any kind of like incentives instead of regulation?
Yes, another policy that we recommend is a policy where instead of having the cookie cutter kind of zoning ordinance where you're saying every lot has to be 5 acres or 1 acre or half an acre, you can imagine that if you're cumulatively adding in housing, that's going to eat up a lot of land. So one thing that local governments can do is have what can be called an open space ordinance or a cluster ordinance. There's different names for them. Is to take the parcel that a developer might own and add up the number of housing units they might get based on that cookie cutter method, but then allow them to group the homes together, which saves space, it saves building costs. Sometimes communities will offer a density bonus. So they'll say you can have another couple of lots if you design your development this way. And then with the leftover land, after you put those homes on a closer together, that land can be put into a conservation easement and preserved in perpetuity. And so we see that happening in a lot of the communities. Ann Arbor Township had a development, and as you say, I'm a trustee in Ann Arbor Township, and before that I was a planning commissioner there. So we had a development that came in and on a piece of farmland, and they wanted to put in homes. They ended up clustering the homes together on, not really dense because you're out in the township and there is not water and sewer there, but they were able to preserve 80% of the land as farmland. It's still farmland and also some woodlots and wetlands on the property. So, so you can make a big impact that way as well.
That's great. It reminds me when I was growing up, we lived on 100 acres that we rented. My parents rented to a farmer. And when my parents got old and sold the property, my father thought it would be a good thing if he split the land up into 10-acre lots. And so each still had a rural feel to it, but it was taken out of farming. Nobody could farm it with everybody in one 10-acre lot. So if he had clustered the housing, people could have a view of the farm out their windows like I did growing up. And I mean, you'd still have the same amount of new homes because, we have to build new homes, but.
It's kind of non-intuitive. So I grew up in the suburbs in Detroit, and we actually moved to the suburbs to be out in the country. And it was nice having a larger lot. There's some woods nearby, but it wasn't really being, out in the country because you're surrounded by you're not really getting out in the country. You're kind of in a middle zone between urban and being in the wilderness or being in farmland. Therefore, you have to drive everywhere. There's not really a lot of intact natural areas for you to enjoy. You're having all sorts of impacts on water quality that, of course, just as a regular family, we weren't even aware of. And so that's what we like to see at the Watershed Council. We have a key message, which is that to truly preserve the watershed, you want to encourage density in areas where it would give you a high quality of life and you wouldn't have to drive everywhere. So in other words, in cities, villages, places where you can have towns, places where you can walk to school, bike to work, those kinds of things. And then out in the country, you want to have the least amount of development possible. And so this results both in more climate resiliency because you don't need to drive cars, you're not producing as much greenhouse gases, and also it preserves water quality. And I think it's a better quality of life in a lot of ways. You can get out to the natural areas when you want to get out and recreate. There's plenty of, look at the city of Ann Arbor. There's so many nice parks, but yet you can bike places. It's not exactly perfect, but I think it's, when I moved here to go to school from the suburbs, I thought it was just wonderful. I was like, I can't believe that people lived like this. It was great.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I've been reading recently about the psychological benefits. Well, you hear a lot about the color green, trees, anything green, people feel more mentally healthy. But recently I've been hearing about the color blue, being near water, whether it be oceans, lakes, or rivers, does something to people psychologically.
I think it does. It's good for us, our mental health, our physical health, of course. And there is a lot of data that talks about the need for humans to be out in the natural world. And if you think about it, that's where we came from. That's where we evolved. So I think that there's a lot going on with the sense of smell, hearing, sight.
When I get somewhere where I can't hear road noise, it's so peaceful, and that's so unusual. And also the night sky, when you can have less light pollution, that's really, really special to be able to see the stars.
And I think that's important too, not just for people who live out in the country to have, obviously, but for people who live in urban areas. If what we're saying is that we want people to live in urban areas, right, in order to preserve our water quality, our climate, and our wildlife, we need to make those urban areas livable. And to do that, we need to provide experiences of nature within those urban areas. So it's equally important, if not more important, for these land preservation programs to look towards access to these areas for everyone in an equitable way. And there's been a lot of research done also on the inequitable way that parks systems have been developed. And I hope to see more done in terms of providing more equitable access to the natural experience, because the more people can experience the natural world, of course, the more constituency we'll have to protect the natural world as well.
So in your email to me, you mentioned change makers. What are you referring to there?
So Change Makers is our program to let people who live in all of these different communities in our watershed become a voice in their community so they can influence their local government's clean water policy. So I mentioned the ordinances and master planning and millage programs that local governments can enact to protect water quality in natural areas. Well, all of those local governments have a board of trustees, elected officials, and planning commission, and some of them have other kinds of committees like a natural areas committee. So all of those boards have just basically regular local residents who are members. So you don't need to be an expert or a planner or a professional to be on those boards. They need their residents to become involved in their local government. Well, and the Watershed Council needs the residents all over the watershed to be involved in local government as well, and to push for these kinds of policies and ordinances. So the Changemakers Boot Camp, we call it, it's a 2-hour session where we go over a lot of the things that we talked about today, the land and water connection and the importance of land use planning and local ordinances in all of this. And then we talk about how those residents can become involved in their local governments, whether it be by being elected, which is that's a lot to ask for, to run and become an elected official, to being on a planning commission, which is an appointed position, to just being someone who goes to the meetings and voices your concern about things that are happening with development in your community. So we have these Changemakers boot camps about 3 times a year. They were in person and recently they've been virtual. So I would urge people to keep their eyes open on our website for when the next one is. I think we'll be having one in the fall.
Great. Well, I really appreciate everything the Huron River Watershed Council is doing. I mentioned that I live near the river, and when I go down to the river, I see the council's building offices right across the river. And so I'm always reminded of the great work that you do, and we really appreciate it.
Great. Well, that's wonderful that you go down to the river. So then again, the more people go down and enjoy that, the better off we'll all be, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And they're using it so much down there with the cascades. And I think that's super important for having people understand the importance of water quality, because if that water gets so polluted we can't go in it, that's going to be devastating for so many people that do all kinds of boating and fishing there. And of course, that's just one tiny example of all the different, places in the Huron River that people use. Well, thank you so much. We're out of time. Kris, I really appreciate you being here today.
Sure. Thank you very much for having this program.
For this and all our Green Room shows, please go to washtenaw.org/greenroom. Thanks for joining us here in the Green Room.